Please excuse me. Well, I really feel a bit like the odd man out here today. Pam, that was absolutely wonderful, and took me back to days when I was scurrying down the banks to the railways. But please bear with me. I'm the last person before the break. I'm just going to roll a lot of pictures and give you an idea of what conservation maybe is like in Africa today, and then try and intertwine it with what Robin's doing. Robin's been a friend for a very long time. I have enormous respect for what he's done and love for the English countryside. But let me take you, please, just for 5 or 6 minutes, into Africa. When I was 20, sent by the Express Dairy Company to an outward bound school in the Lake District, an instructor by the name of Campbell Wally, a former game warden in the Serengeti, told me that if I wanted to go to Africa, I better get there soon before Africa was gone, and in his opinion, I was 50 years too late anyway. Now, each generation's been saying this to the next since the days of Livingstone. That's what Teddy Roosevelt probably said to Kermit, and for all I know, what Burton said to Speke. In the 60s, Campbell worried about the decline in Africa's wildlife and the destruction of its fragile environments at the hand of man. Then, by today's standards, East Africa was the Garden of Eden. Wildlife occurred virtually all over the continent. Hundreds of thousands of black rhinos covered the hills, and the plains and elephants, probably 10 million plus, were so thick on the ground that one could drive from South Africa to Egypt and probably never lose sight of them if you could find a track. There were maybe 1 million elephant left at the beginning of the last century, and less than 450,000 now and counting. It's easy to get nostalgic about it all. We have little time anymore, even for nostalgia. Because, believe me, if the African countries that are host to these animals just don't want them anymore, or would rather trade their teeth and toenails for short-term gain, then it's all over. And in a continent prone to droughts, floods, massively increasing populations, and an inability to feed itself, what then? The big 6 industries of the underworld, drugs, arms, human trafficking, wildlife and forestry, and fake goods, are all thriving and evolving strange partnerships between religious zealots, crooked capitalists, and struggling and corrupt regimes. Yet the lines between organized crime and terrorism have become blurred. Conferences are held, tusks and horns are burnt in admirable demonstrations of solidarity with the pressures from the more civilized parts of the world. But I get the feeling we're just hiding behind the slaughter and suffering of these majestic animals, sometimes even for our own gain. Al-Shabaab is largely funded through charcoal, Boko Haram through the trafficking of schoolgirls, ivory and rhino horn are surrogate gold bars, and Al-Qaeda et al. An evil global franchise. Their unwitting PR department, the international media. But let us not forget that we started it. We had elephant tusks as piano keys, billiard balls, and living room clutter for well over a century. Their feet as rubbish baskets. Rhino heads adorn the walls of the rich and the museums, and a lucrative trade set up with the East for their horns. Colonial governments wanted all the wild animals killed so they could get on and tame the land, most of it unsuitable for anything except wildlife. So now we live with the seeds of our own destruction. But in Mkomazi in Tanzania, we have been able to reverse the trends of a generation. Over 25 years, a trashed out 1,500 square mile piece of land, a misused game reserve from the 50s in name only, has been turned into a national park. The land has been reclaimed from decades of overgrazing, habitat destruction, and poaching. Species numbers have built up, and the reintroduction of the most seriously depleted and endangered species, the black rhino and the African hunting dog, has taken place in a difficult, even suffocating working environment. But in the 50 years I've been away in Africa, the land that gave me my love of countryside and wildlife seems to have turned into a scientifically manicured garden. Changes in farming in the past half-century to drastically and artificially push up quantities of food produced are destroying species from nightingales to butterflies and peregrines. Policymakers and some scientists duck the issue by blaming all the things damaging nature on climate change instead of the vested interests. Numbers of grey partridges, corn buntings, and tree sparrows have dropped by at least 90% in 40 years, leaving them all at risk of vanishing from Britain. Indigenous red squirrels, hammered by our transatlantic cousins, brown hares, and skylarks, all need to be introduced where they can flourish. I'm looking at the damage that's been done to Africa in the 50 years that I've been there, and I'm seeing the same damage here in the English countryside. There seems to be a reticence to tackle damaging farming practices head on. If England doesn't change course away from industrial agriculture, then its wildlife, food, and future generations will suffer. Practices introduced after the Second World War have proved a perfect storm for wiping out birds and bees, as well as the plants and insects they feed on. Everything accelerated by chemical fertilizers and insecticides, and we see the same in Africa. Some scientists say that with ongoing advances, the disappearance of our ponds, newts, toads, birds, bees, and indeed most of the natural world to this Armageddon won't matter. But what if they're wrong? Indigenous forests are removed and sheep stuck on hillsides. All rivers become spate rivers. I've not gone back to Scotland in years, and Dartmoor, when I worked there years ago, had long shed its forest mantle for peat bogs, cows, and sheep. We all know that the loss of natural habitat has had a serious impact on wildlife across the globe. While the ice caps are melting and the rainforest shrinking, the one environment on the planet that is booming is cities. 6 billion humans will live in urban areas by 2045, and they're not alone. But this is all too depressing and futuristic when action needs to be taken now while there is still a little time. There are a few voices in the wilderness, but none so strong as that of the edgy, articulate, and eminently practical Robin Page and his Countryside Restoration Trust. While I have been away trying to save Africa's wildlife, destined more and more to become isolated, fenced islands in a sea of rapidly increasing people and domestic stock. Sound familiar? The CRT's aim for conservation improvements to be carried out alongside practical farming has our respect and full support as a preservation rather than a conservation trust. Robin took me out one cold day in Cambridge to see the redoubtable badger, who's here tonight, hedging, and the reconstruction of a tiny wetland, complete with fauna and flora. And I couldn't help but compare that to my life, involving armed bandits, organized hits, massive corruption, racist sentiments, bulldozers, JCBs, graders, aircraft, local and national politics, rhinos, elephants, and goodness knows what else. And there was Robin waxing eloquent about his newts. But it's all the same. Blood, sweat, and tears, and fighting human greed and the modern day pressures for more at the cost of the natural world around us. Whilst we might not be able to stop the population from growing, we can educate the people who currently live here and the new ones that are being born to make smarter choices and consume more responsibly and have respect for what got us here, and not just prioritize on the kit to get to where we think we're going. 400 generations had to pass to take Europe from Stone Age farming to industrial agriculture. Yet in the past 100 years, we've trashed our seas our skies and our lands. It is said that nothing can prevent the spread of the human virus, but who knows? There could be a miracle. In the meantime, we must do all that we can to restore the balance of nature in our own lifetime. If we do not, future generations will feel it, that gnawing sense of something lost, and they will blame us for their grief and their demise. I applaud and congratulate all members and heroes of the Countryside Restoration Trust for all you are doing to restore some sanity and balance in this beautiful country. And if there's ever a need for bears, wolves, and saber-toothed tigers, then I'm your man.